Hey, Prestonwood.Live, it's Jack Raymond, online community pastor, and really grateful and excited to be with you for our devotional this week. Well, we just rolled out of our 7-part devotional series on the I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John. I hope you were encouraged and challenged and learned a lot from this series. I know I learned a lot just on these powerful statements of who Jesus is, what he does, and how he moves in our world today. In fact, if you missed any of those, we're going to drop a link to that whole series in the comments below. So I hope you'll click on that, watch, be encouraged, and of course, as always, share with others, especially as a new platform. It's just a great opportunity for us to reach people, not just here in Texas, but prayerfully all over the world with God's Word. And so for this week's devotional, I want us to focus on this question and to think about it, to meditate on it, and to look at what God's Word says about this question. And that question is, how should we as Christians define success? How do we define success? What is success for us in our everyday lives? After all, this is something that we think about at every stage, at every area of life. Success in our relationships, success at work, success in our community, success even in our churches. How do we define success? And we're going to look at Matthew chapter 25, and Jesus is teaching. In fact, he's going to share a parable in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. This parable is often known as the parable of the talents. So we're going to set the stage and hear what Jesus says in verses 14 through 15. Again, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 and 15. Jesus says, "For it is like a man about to go on a journey. He called his own servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, and to the other 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, depending on each one's ability. Then he went on a journey." And so this is setting the stage. So here is the master, and he has 3 servants. To one he entrusts 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1. So we have 3 different servants. And so we're not going to read the whole parable. I do encourage you at some point to read this, to think, to meditate, and to pray on all of it. But essentially, to summarize what happens next is the servant with 5 talents, he goes and invests it, and he makes 5 talents more. The servant with 2 talents goes invests it and makes 2 talents more. But the servant with 1 talent just sits on it and says, "I'm going to hide it," and he still has that 1 talent. Well, it says after a long time that the master returns. And when he deals with each servant, we see one of the key answers to how God and how we should view success. And the first thought and the first takeaway I want for us as we think about that question, how do we define success as Christians? Well, number one, first takeaway is this, that our success is defined by God's definition. Or we can think of it this way, that God defines our success in His way. God defines our success in His way. Because from a worldly perspective, someone might read this story and say, well, obviously the most successful servant is the one who made 5 more and now is 10. But what's amazing is the master comes back and responds in the same way to the one who has 5 and to the one who has 2. It's not a question of how much about the servants, but it's another key factor. How does God define success? Well, look at the master's response in this parable. Verse 21, the master says to the first servant, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of the master." And then the amazing thing is the exact same thing as said in verse 23 to the second servant. Because you see, the master wasn't defining success by money, by possessions, by fruit, or any of that. No, the master and God defines success by faithfulness. And he says, "Well done, good and what? Faithful servant." That is how God defines success for each and every one of us. And what an amazing truth that is, that regardless of the stage of life we're in, regardless of the culture, regardless of the place, regardless of the season of life we're in, we can all be found faithful. In fact, the master, if we look at the response, says again, says, "Well done, good and faithful. You are faithful over a few things." And so much of success boils down to the small things. Are we faithful in the daily? Are we faithful in the mundane, the small things of life? Because all those add up. And when we do, we get to enter and experience the joy of the master. And that leads us to the second takeaway. So number one, God defines our success in His way. Well, number two, the second takeaway is that God rewards our success in His timing. If we were to look at the broader context of what's going on in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus has just come off teaching on the second coming in Matthew 24. He's teaching that he is going to return, because Matthew 25, if you know the length of Matthew, is 28 chapters. So we're very, very, very near the cross, the crucifixion, Jesus' death, and ultimately, of course, his victory in the resurrection, and then into his ascension as well. The cross and the crucifixion comes in chapter 27. Chapter 28 is his resurrection, and then the Great Commission at the end of Matthew. So we're in chapter 25, so we are near the end. So Jesus is teaching not just on the cross here, but he's teaching, hey, I'm going to come back. And so in Matthew 24, he's teaching over and over on the second coming of Christ. And it's something that it's easy for us as Christians not to think about that often. It's easy to get distracted by the everyday things of life, but we have to always be thinking about the second coming of Christ. Why? Well, Matthew 24, verse 44, Jesus teaches us this. It says, "This is why you are also to be ready, because the Son of Man is coming at an hour that no one expects." So when we zoom back in on the parable of Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, we see at the very beginning it says that the master goes on a long journey, and we read this, that the servants don't know when the master is coming back. And the same is true for us. We don't know when Christ is going to come back. It could be today. It could be tomorrow. And what does that mean? What is the takeaway? That means we have to be found faithful right now. We have to be ready for Jesus to come back, because God is going to reward our success in his timing. We have to trust his timing, because you see, the third servant, unlike the first two, was found not faithful but unfaithful. And the master is going to say that you were wicked and you were lazy. You were unfaithful. And may that never be said about us. May we always be thinking and being ready for Jesus' return. And so my challenge for all of us, myself included this week, is for us to be faithful. Faithful in the small things. When we go to work, that we be faithful to be honest, faithful to work hard, faithful to love and to serve and to encourage others. When we think about our family, quality time with family, that we be faithful. Faithful to serve our spouse if we're married. Faithful to serve our kids if we have kids, our grandkids. To pass on God's word and God's love to everyone around us. As we think about being faithful in our community, faithful in our churches, that we wouldn't be like the third servant of sitting on the sidelines, of just taking our talent and covering it up, but that we would be like those first two servants, and that we wouldn't focus on what other people are doing, but that we would want to be faithful in the little things each and every day. So Prestonwood.Live, our challenge is that we would be found faithful, so that Jesus might say to us as well, "Well done, good and faithful servants. You have been faithful over a little. Now I will put you over much. Enter into the joy of the master." Well, let's experience the joy of Jesus. Let's experience his joy today and this week, and then let's share his joy with others. Well, I hope that you are encouraged by our devotional. Again, take some time this week to read through Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, this powerful parable from Jesus. Share what you've learned with others. Again, we always want to encourage you to subscribe so that you'll catch every devotional, other new content that we have coming, and then share this with others. Well, we're so grateful for you, Prestonwood.Live. Know that we're praying for you, and we look forward to tuning in with you next week for our next